The grain buyer's name was Eldon Pruitt, and he had spent 31 years driving the back roads of eastern Nebraska without ever stopping at a farm he hadn't already decided was worth his time. He didn't waste mornings. He didn't make courtesy calls. When Eldon Pruitt pulled his truck down a gravel driveway, it meant something. He pulled down Mabel Stanton's driveway on a Tuesday in October of 1979, and he sat in his cab for a moment before climbing out, the way a man does when he wants to take stock of a thing before committing to an opinion. What he saw was rows of winter wheat, so even they looked like they'd been coned. A barn that had been repainted recently. Not the whole thing, just the south wall where the wood had started to go. A woman in her mid-40s standing near a grain bin with a clipboard. Not watching him, not waiting for him, just working. He climbed out. She didn't look up right away. That was the first thing Eldon would tell people later when they asked him how he'd found her. He'd say, she didn't come running. She finished what she was writing first. Most of Harlan County knew Mabel Stanton the way small towns know the women who stay after the men leave. They knew her as Gerald's wife, then as Gerald's ex-wife, then simply as the woman out on Route 9 who'd taken the farmstead in the settlement and was, by most accounts, going to lose it inside of 3 years. Gerald had kept the equipment dealership in town. Mabel had kept 280 acres of flat Nebraska land, a tractor that needed a new fuel pump, a barn with a soft spot in the floor, and 2 teenage children who were old enough to understand exactly how bad things were. Her son, 15-year-old Nate, understood it the way teenage boys understand hard things, by getting quiet and working without being asked. Her daughter, 13-year-old Susan, understood it by crying in her room for 2 weeks and then emerging one morning and asking what needed to be done. Mabel had stood in the kitchen that morning, looking at her daughter's red-rimmed eyes and felt something settle in her chest. Not peace exactly, more like the feeling of a door closing behind you. There was no going back through it, so you went forward. What people in Harlan County did not know about Mabel Stanton, what they couldn't have known, because she had never been given reason to show it, was that she had been quietly studying agriculture for most of her adult life, not because Gerald had asked her to, not because she had any official role on the farm, but because the land was there, outside the kitchen window, every single morning, and she had a mind that did not know how to leave a thing alone. She had read, she had watched, she had kept notes in a series of composition notebooks that she stored in a box under the bed, notes about soil composition and crop rotation and moisture retention and cover crops, notes about things she'd observed on their land that didn't match what the extension office said should be happening. Notes that represented 15 years of a woman paying attention to something she was not supposed to be in charge of. When the farm became hers, she already knew what was wrong with it. Gerald had been farming it the same way his father had farmed it, which was the same way his grandfather had farmed it, which had made sense in 1930 and made considerably less sense in 1974. The soil in the east fields was depleted. The drainage in the low corner near the property line was causing rot in the root systems every wet spring. The tractor schedule was inefficient. The seed selection was sentimental rather than strategic. Mabel stood in the east field 2 weeks after the divorce was final, crouched down with a handful of soil and felt the problem in her palm. Dry, gray, the color of something that has been asked to give too much for too long. She knew what she needed to do. She also knew that knowing what to do and having the money to do it were 2 entirely different problems. The first person to laugh at her did it kindly, which was almost worse. His name was Pete Dalloway, and he ran the co-op in Minden, and he had known Mabel peripherally for years, the way men in small agricultural towns know the wives of other men. Well enough to be polite, not well enough to take seriously. When she came in and told him what she was planning, he leaned back in his chair and smiled in the way that people smile when they're trying not to say something. "Mabel," he said, "cover cropping is fine for hobby farms. You're talking about 280 acres. You start rotating in clover and rye, and you're going to cut your corn yield by 1/3 the first year, maybe more." She told him she understood that. He looked at her over his glasses. "Gerald know you're doing this." She kept her face still. "Gerald lives on Maple Street now, Pete. He doesn't know much about what I'm doing." She bought what she needed, not everything she wanted, because the budget required sequencing. She went home and updated her notebook. What Pete Dalloway told the other men at the co-op that afternoon, She would only learn about much later. He'd told them she was going to plant clover on a working corn farm. He'd told them, with a kind of weary affection that was worse than cruelty, that somebody ought to check on those kids. There were harder moments than Pete Dalloway. The hardest one happened on a Wednesday in April of her first spring, when she drove the tractor to the implement dealer in town. A different dealer than Gerald's. She was careful about that, to get the fuel pump looked at. She'd had to borrow against the farm to buy seed. She'd had $40 in her checking account. The repair was going to cost $60. She sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes before going inside. The mechanic, a young man she didn't know, was fine, professional. It was the two older men sitting on the bench outside the service bay who were the problem. She recognized one of them, a retired farmer named Lou Geddes who had sold his place some years back and now seemed to pass his days delivering commentary on the decisions of people still in the game. She heard him say her name as she was walking back to her truck. Not loud, just loud enough. She didn't stop walking. Nate, who had come with her that day, was 16 and already taller than his father. He heard it too. She could tell by the way his jaw moved. She put her hand on his arm before he could turn around. "Don't," she said. "Mom. The best answer to that," she said, "is a combine full of corn in October." She drove home. She put the $60 on the co-op account and adjusted the spring budget and sat at the kitchen table until she had a plan that worked. It was close, but it worked. The notebook system by this point had become something more than notes. She had started it years ago as a way of making sense of what she observed, but by the second year on her own, it had evolved into a kind of farm management system more precise than anything the Extension Office had on offer. She tracked soil moisture estimates by field section. She recorded germination rates by seed lot. She noted which corners of which fields showed stress first in a dry summer and which ones held moisture longest after a wet spring. She wrote down the things that didn't work and the reasons she thought they hadn't worked and what she planned to try differently. Susan, by then 14 and possessed of a particular kind of quiet intelligence that reminded Mabel uncomfortably of herself at that age, started reading the notebooks without being asked. "You've got the northeast corner of the east field down as a problem every single year," Susan said one evening. "I do. Because of the drainage. Have you thought about—" "The tile drain," Mabel said. "Yes. It's in the plan for year 3 if year 2 goes the way I think it will." Susan was quiet for a moment, looking at the notebook. "You planned this out 3 years in advance?" 4, actually. Susan looked at her mother with an expression that was not quite awe and not quite something else, but somewhere in between. She didn't say anything. She closed the notebook carefully, the way you close something that matters. Year 2 went the way Mabel thought it would. Not perfectly. The late frost in May cost her some of the early planting in the west field, and she had to make decisions about what to replant and what to leave, and those decisions cost her sleep. But the cover crop rotation in the east field was already showing results that she could measure. Organic matter in the soil up, erosion down, and something she noted in her records as texture improvement that would have been hard to explain to Pete Dalloway, but was unmistakable to anyone who spent time with their hands in the dirt. The corn yield that fall was down, as she had told Pete it would be, 14% below the county average. She heard about it from 2 directions. From Gerald's side of things through the children, and from the general low murmur of opinion that ran through Harlan County whenever someone did something different. She wrote the yield number down in her notebook, next to the soil test results, next to the moisture readings, next to the cover crop tonnage. She looked at all of it together. The number that mattered was not the one everyone was talking about. Nate left for the University of Nebraska in the fall of his 3rd year on the farm. He had a partial scholarship and a work-study job and a set of opinions about soil science that were not typical for an 18-year-old from a small Nebraska town. Opinions he'd developed by working alongside his mother and arguing with her about methodology and losing most of those arguments. The morning he left, he stood in the kitchen with his duffel bag and didn't say much. Mabel made eggs. They ate. She walked him to the truck, and he put his bag in and turned around. "The northeast corner," he said. "Year 3, she said. "It's in the plan." He nodded. He got in the truck. He drove away, and she stood at the end of the driveway and watched until she couldn't see him anymore, and then she turned around and went back to work, because that was the only honest thing she knew how to do. Susan stayed. Not because she had no other options. She was sharp enough that options would come, but because she had looked at the farm with the same careful eyes her mother had and seen the same thing. Something in process. Something not yet finished. She wanted to see how it turned out. Year 3 was when things began to shift in ways that other people could see. The tile drainage project in the northeast corner of the east field cost more than Mabel had planned for, and less than she had feared. She did as much of the labor as she could herself, which was considerable. The implement dealer mechanic who came out to consult on the excavation work, a different young man than the one before, someone who actually knew his business, walked the field with her and listened to her explain what she'd observed over 3 years and why she believed the problem was where she believed it was. He was quiet for a while after she finished. "You mapped this yourself," he said. "I kept records," she said. He looked at the notebook she was holding. He looked at the field. "You're right about the gradient," he said. "Right about where the water's going." He paused. "Most of the farmers I work with, they call me when they already have water in the barn. You're fixing a drainage problem before you've had a flood." She said she preferred it that way. He smiled at the field in the way that people smile when they've seen something they didn't expect, not condescending. Something more like respect, which was different. The drainage went in that spring. The east field responded the way she had calculated it would, which was not dramatically and not immediately, but steadily, measurably, in the way that good decisions tend to work. Quietly, at first, then unmistakably. By harvest that fall, the east field yield was up 11% from the previous year. The west field, where she'd planted the new variety she'd been researching for 2 years, was up 8. The overall farm yield was still not exceptional by county standards, but the trend line in her notebook was pointing in one direction, and it had been pointing that way consistently for 3 years. And Mabel Stanton trusted trend lines more than single-year numbers. She noted everything. She updated every column. She made her plan for year 4. The conversation at the grain elevator happened on a Thursday morning in November. She had come to settle the season's account, which was now, for the first time since the divorce, settled comfortably rather than desperately, not richly, comfortably. There was a difference, and she felt it differently in her body, a kind of release of tension she hadn't fully known was there. There were 3 men ahead of her in line. She recognized all of them. 2 were farmers she'd known for years, peripherally. The third was Gerald's cousin, a man named Ray who had never had any particular feelings about her one way or another, but was Gerald's cousin, which placed him in a category. She heard her name in the conversation before they knew she was behind them. Not the full sentence, just her name and the word lucky in the same breath. She waited. She stepped up to the window when it was her turn. She settled her account. She thanked the young man at the window, who she didn't know but who had always been professional. She walked back to her truck. She sat in it for 30 seconds. Then she drove home and she sat at the kitchen table with the full ledger for the year, and she looked at every number in it, the inputs, the outputs, the debt reduction, the soil test improvements, the 4 years of consistent trend. There was nothing lucky in any of it. There was just work and attention and a refusal to be managed by someone else's opinion of what was possible. She closed the ledger. She made coffee. Eldon Pruitt had first heard about her farm from the mechanic, the one who had consulted on the drainage project at a farm equipment trade show in Lincoln in the spring. The mechanic was not a man who talked much about his clients, but he had mentioned in the context of a conversation about how farmers tended to ignore drainage problems until they became disasters. A woman out in Harlan County who had identified and fixed a drainage issue through 4 years of systematic record-keeping before it ever caused a significant loss. Eldon had asked a few questions. The mechanic had answered them. Eldon had written something in his notebook. 18 months later, he was pulling down her driveway. He found her at the grain bin with her clipboard, and when she finally looked up, she looked at him the way people look at someone they don't know but have been expecting, in some general sense. Not this person, not this Tuesday, but someone like this, sometime like now. "Eldon Pruitt," he said. "I buy for a regional distribution operation out of Grand Island." "I know who you are," Mabel said. He nodded once. I heard about your east field rotation. From the mechanic. From the mechanic. She looked at him without any particular expression. She did not appear nervous or eager or any of the things that people who want to sell something usually appear. She appeared like someone who had been working and had paused to deal with an interruption and was prepared to give the interruption a fair hearing. I'd like to walk the fields, he said. She gestured toward the east field. Then let's walk. They walked for an hour and 15 minutes. Eldon asked questions the way a man asks questions when he already knows a significant portion of the answers and is interested in the remainder. He asked about the rotation schedule, about the seed varieties, about the drainage modification, about the soil testing protocol. He asked about the cover crop mix in the fallow sections. He asked about yield variance year over year. Mabel answered everything without consulting notes. The notes were in her head by now. They had been in her head for years. At one point, standing at the northeast corner of the east field, the problem corner, the fixed corner, Eldon crouched down and picked up a handful of soil and held it for a moment and put it down. This is different from the fields on either side of you, he said. Yes, she said. Your neighbor to the east. He's been farming that ground longer than you have. He has. Eldon looked at the field. And yours is better. She didn't say anything to that. It wasn't a question. He stood up and brushed his hands together and looked at the horizon for a moment, the way men look at horizons when they're finishing a thought. I'll be honest with you, he said. I don't sign contracts at a first visit. I've been doing this long enough to know that a good harvest and a good approach are not always the same farm twice running. That's sensible, she said. But I'd like to come back in the spring. Walk the fields again before planting. She looked at him steadily. You're welcome to. He came back in the spring. He came back the fall after that. On his third visit, standing in the same east field where the conversation had started 2 years earlier, he told her what he was prepared to offer for a supply contract. It was a fair number. It was considerably more than she'd been getting from the co-op. She did not say yes immediately. She told him she'd look at the terms and be in touch by the end of the week. He blinked, just slightly. He was not accustomed to being told to wait. But he nodded. End of the week is fine, he said. She called him on Thursday with 2 modifications to the contract language. He accepted both of them. They shook hands on a Friday afternoon in October while Susan stood nearby, leaning against the barn, watching with her arms folded in an expression that was very nearly a smile. Pete Dalloway heard about the contract from someone at the elevator. He drove out to the farm the following week, ostensibly about a different matter. They stood in the driveway. I hear Pruitt's buying from you now, he said. He is. Pete looked at the fields. He looked at the barn. He looked at the equipment lined up neatly along the side of the property. He was quiet for a moment, with the look of a man doing arithmetic in his head that keeps coming out differently than he expected. The cover cropping, he said. Among other things. He nodded slowly. He didn't say he'd been wrong, because men like Pete Dalloway rarely said that in so many words. But he stood there in her driveway, with his hat in his hands, and the silence had a shape to it. The soil work, he said finally. That east corner, how long had you been planning that before you did it? 3 years before I had the farm, she said, give or take. He looked at her. He put his hat back on. All right, he said. Which was the closest he was going to get. Nate graduated in the spring and came back to the farm, not because he had no other options, but because the farm was, by then, a genuinely interesting agricultural operation, and he was, by then, a young man with a degree in agronomy and strong opinions about no-till methodology that his mother was willing to debate seriously and at length. He brought new ideas. Some of them were good. She told him which ones and why, and they argued about the ones she wasn't sure about, and she updated her notebooks accordingly. Susan went to Lincoln for college. She came back on weekends sometimes and sat at the kitchen table with the ledgers the way she had sat with the notebooks years earlier, with that same expression, careful, attentive, not quite awe. The farm did not become famous. It did not appear in any magazine. Mabel Stanton did not give speeches or win awards or become a symbol of anything. She was a woman in eastern Nebraska who had taken a depleted piece of ground and understood it better than anyone and worked it accordingly. What she had at the end of the decade was a farm with healthy soil and a fair contract and children who knew what careful work looked like. She had notebooks full of data that represented 15 years of paying attention to something she loved. She had a driveway that Eldon Pruitt came down twice a year without having to be asked. She also had something that was harder to put in the notebook, but that she felt on certain mornings when she walked the east field before anyone else was up. When the light came in low from the east and hit the wheat at an angle that made it look like it was made of something more valuable than grain. It was the feeling of a thing that had been doubted and had not changed itself in response to the doubting. The feeling of a process carried through to its completion, not because anyone was watching, but because the work itself required it. She had known somewhere in her that the land would answer if she asked it the right questions. She had just needed time and silence and the particular stubbornness of a person who has stopped needing to be believed before they begin. The wheat moved in the early morning wind, and she stood there watching it, and she did not need anyone to tell her what she already knew. I keep thinking about that handful of soil. Not the contract, not the moment Eldon Pruitt pulled down the driveway. The moment before any of that, Mabel crouched in the east field 2 weeks after the divorce was final, holding a fistful of gray, depleted dirt, and knowing exactly what it needed. Nobody had given her permission to know that. Nobody had asked her to spend 15 years paying attention. She just had, because the land was there and her mind didn't know how to leave a thing alone. That's the part that stays with me. Not the success, the preparation that happened in silence, long before success was even a reasonable expectation. What Mabel did, and I think this is the thing most people miss when they hear a story like hers, wasn't luck, and it wasn't stubbornness in the blind, grinding sense. It was something more deliberate than that. She had looked at her situation honestly, which takes a kind of integrity that's harder than it sounds. It would have been easy to believe what Pete Dalloway believed, what the men at the elevator believed, what Gerald's cousin Ray believed, that a woman who hadn't been in charge of the farm officially couldn't possibly understand it deeply. She could have accepted that story. A lot of people accept the stories others tell about them. She didn't. She just kept writing in her notebooks and updating her columns and letting the trend line say what it said. That's the thing I find myself returning to, the honesty of it, the refusal to manage her own self-image at the expense of accuracy. She wrote down when things failed. She wrote down the yields that were down 14% and sat with that number alongside all the other numbers and let the full picture be what it was. There's a kind of moral seriousness in that, a commitment to truth over comfort that I think is rarer than we admit. And then there's the intelligence of it. Mabel didn't just work hard. She thought carefully. She sequenced. She planned the tile drainage 3 years before she had the money for it, because she understood that the right move done too early or too late was still the wrong move. She knew which problems were symptoms and which were causes. That kind of thinking doesn't come from a classroom, necessarily. It comes from years of careful observation combined with the discipline to record what you see rather than what you wish were true. But what I think about most is what it cost her to keep going when nothing external was confirming that she should. Nate heard Lou Geddes say her name in a parking lot and wanted to turn around. She put her hand on his arm. She said, "The best answer is a combine full of corn in October." She wasn't performing toughness. She meant it. She had decided, somewhere along the way, that other people's doubt was simply not relevant data. It didn't go in the notebook. It didn't affect the plan. I think that's what persistence actually looks like when it isn't dressed up for an audience. Not defiance, not anger, just a quiet, private decision to continue doing the work that the work requires, on the schedule that the work requires, regardless of who is watching or what they're saying while they watch. The wheat moved in the early morning wind, and she already knew what she knew.